Congratulations and welcome to the economics portion of this year-long lesson. If you are still with me, congratulate yourselves. You've managed to stay awake through 15 weeks of government. Now my challenge is to keep you awake during 15 weeks of economics. It's not going to be that bad, although, again, as we mentioned in some of our government classes, talking just about economics, the very thought of that bores some people to tears. And there's a reason for that. Economics, if you study just the terminology and some of the models, it can get very boring. We're going to try to avoid some of that. We're trying to make the economy really what it is. It is a vibrant thing. It's not static. It's not mathematics. It's not a formula where you plug and chug numbers and come up with an answer. The economy is a vibrant, dynamic thing. It is forever changing, and no matter who you are, no matter where you live, economic realities are going to be a very, very big part of your life. You can get a leg up on a lot of things by being economically literate. You don't have to be an expert. As we will discover, even being an expert does not make you an expert on economics. It is a science, but it is one of the weirder sciences. It's part mathematics, part human nature, part conjecture. I'm going to read a little bit in the book now. If you haven't seen it before, and I didn't know I was going to have to do this as your teacher, but this is the text I'll be going from, and this is the one I want you to get. Exploring Economics is written by Notgrass, the same person that wrote your government textbook. And we'll be teaching off of that, but most of what we're going to be doing is, again, these video presentations and our discussion in class on Mondays. I will have some quizzes. I know I got away from the quizzes during the last few weeks of government simply because those segments did not have very many answerable questions. It was more debate, theory, your opinions and stuff like that. And by the way, I think all of you did a very good job in sharing with me your opinions on government functions as they pertain to the last 3 lessons. I really appreciate y'all opening up in class. As long as you don't talk too much, you're okay. But I really do appreciate it. Let's look at economics. I'm going to read verbatim a couple of things out of the book. A factory closes in your town. 300 people lose their jobs because the company has decided to move to Mexico. What will all of those former employees do for work? You're thinking about applying for a summer job at a new clothing store because they carry nice apparel that you like. However, it's the 7th clothing store in the same shopping area. If it doesn't stay in business, you might be out of work the rest of the summer. What's your best move? A family that lives down the road is moving to a less expensive house. The mother had to have surgery for a brain tumor. They're having a hard time paying all the medical expenses. What economic realities are they facing? We are going to be looking here in economics at some of the basic terms, hopefully, again, a general understanding of what economics is, and not necessarily in this week, but in a couple of the units, we'll be doing lots of biblical tie-ins and trying to determine what God tells us about economics. Yes, there is a lot of attention paid in the Bible to the idea of economics. We're going to be looking at that. As you will be able to see by reading this book and by listening to your crazy teacher here, we tend to believe in the strengths of a free market system. We believe that capitalism, flaws and all, has done far more good than bad, and it has been, according to history, the most efficient, effective, and flourishing economic theorem of all. Whatever is in second place is a distant second. A lot of this is going to sound a little bit like the last couple of weeks of government. And if it reminds you of that, congratulations. That means you were paying attention during government. But yes, and we were talking about government as it pertains to the economy. As we study economics, we're going to be looking at some of that same theory. Some of the same questions that we asked in government class are going to pop up in this first week's lesson on economics. At the same time as we recognize capitalism is the best system, we also recognize that like any other human institution, it has its shortcomings. Capitalists are human. Capitalists are sinners. Capitalists can be greedy, unjust, and exploitative. The free market does not always, 100% of the time, run smoothly. The human factor suggests that there will be inefficiencies even within an economic system as good as capitalism. And we have to recognize those, and we have to address those. Economics is more than just a study of personal finance. It is a study of how resources move. People think it has to do with about money. Money is only a portion of the economy. Economy is about value. It is about how value is formed, how value is created, and how that value is exchanged fairly among people, among nations, among entities. For the first lesson here, we're going to take a look at kind of a hypothetical question. Suppose you, right now, had $500 in your hand, just magically appeared. What would you do? Well, first let's look at how you might have obtained that. You might have obtained that through working as wages. Might have been a gift. Maybe there was something you sold that somebody deemed was worth $500 to them. Economics deals with the value that people place on goods and services. Economics is about making choices about what to do with your resources, and your resources will be limited. I don't care if you're Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, you have limited resources, and the economics is the study of how best to use those limited resources. You could put that money in the bank, have it serve interest. Well, then we have to study how the banking industry works. You might decide to invest that $500 in a business of some sort. Then we have to look at how business investments work. We have to weigh that level of productivity. You might decide to buy something for yourself. Then we have to look at the consumer market. We have to look at all of the dynamics that go into a small business or a large business, if you're using that, and how they make a profit. You might decide to give some of that money to your church or to a charity. Odds are, though, you can't invest it all, you can't spend it all, you can't give it all. You have to make choices about where to send that $500. We'll also, in this unit, consider the government's interest in your money. Of course, the government plays a major role in everything, and most certainly in economics. We've talked about the American income tax structure. We've talked about local sales taxes. So yes, the government, a lot of what we discussed this week is going to be about government's involvement in the economy, the U.S. economy in particular. Now, so far we've assumed you have a choice about what to do with your $500. There are economic systems where you do not have much of a choice on what you do with that $500. We have talked extensively, and we will continue to talk extensively today about the differences, that continuum between a free market capitalistic economy over here and a command socialistic economy over here. These are the two extremes. Over here, you have zero government involvement in an economy. Everything is determined by the market. We'll have a term for that later. Remember, invisible hand. Remember that term. It's all done according to market forces. Over here, all economic decisions are made by central planners. How much gets produced, how much it's sold for, how it's produced, what the workers are paid to produce it. All of that is determined by bureaucrats, by people in a room. And so it goes with this continuum. Everything else other than extreme capitalism or extreme socialism, everything else is called a mixed economy. In the real world here, everybody is a mixed economy to some degree. There's no 100% economy one way or the other. But there are those that lean precipitously in one direction or the other. We also look at the idea of $500. How much is it worth? Why is $500 worth much less today than if you had $500, say, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 250 years ago? It's called inflation, and we'll be discussing that. Well, I mentioned it real quickly here. Inflation is basically a decline in the value of money, which is evident. Even we measure inflation all the time. It's one of the many things we look at in the economy. The very word economics implies stewardship. The root Greek word means steward. So even as we look at this system of the exchange of goods and services and the determination of value, the very word that we use to describe it implies stewardship. That means it's important. I'm not going to get too much into the broad definition of economics. You can get real cutesy with that. I'm not going to worry about that. That's going to be getting lost in the weeds very quickly. Just a couple of terms to remember. Production involves the supply of goods and services available within a society. Producing makes sense. We have questions, of course, about production of goods, but also the production of services. Goods are more than just that which you can see, touch, taste, and smell. You can provide a service that is not tangible, but it still has value. Distribution deals with getting these goods and services available to the public for consumption. Consumption takes place by not only individuals, but by households, businesses, and even entire governments. Economics has to do with more than money. Behind all these issues are policy questions about the government. What trade policies and regulations should the government allow to produce the most effective distribution of products, and what policies regarding money, specifically currency? These are questions that we will always ask about economics. It is a science, but it is an inexact science. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, it is dynamic. Economy is always changing. What did we say last week in our government class? If you want 10 different opinions on how the economy is doing, ask 10 economists how the economy is doing. You're going to get 10 different answers. And all of them will have a degree of truth in them. And Lord knows if any of them are correct, but some of them will get close to the truth. Again, it is an inexact science. People spend their lives trying to figure out this messy thing called an economy. Again, we'll be referring to this a lot. Free market capitalistic economy, command economy, socialism. In a command economy, everyone is employed. There is no unemployment over here. But your job is determined by the government, and the government has final say over what you do. The market does not necessarily include what buyers want. It includes what the government thinks people want. You may want this, but if the government planners decide, we're not going to make that, you don't have it. Because a command economy does not consistently reward productivity and does not provide motivation for profits, goods are not as readily available, and innovation is hampered. As we mentioned last week, what incentive for improvement do you have in a system where you are not going to be rewarded for making such improvement? It is about human nature. Over here, capitalism recognizes human nature. It embraces human nature. It harnesses the power of human nature to produce goods and services in the most efficient way possible. If someone has a better idea, everybody becomes a little bit better, and the person who created that idea benefits directly from it. They are rewarded for it. But again, as we said, economies are all along this continuum. Mixed economies is what we have. Even in the most capitalistic economy, you're going to have some government regulations. And again, we have decided collectively that some government regulations are needed. Why? They are needed to control what we talked about earlier, some of the inherent problems with capitalism, because it is run by humans. Humans can be greedy. Humans can disregard environmental concerns. Humans can exploit workers. That's when we societally, collectively, decide, okay, we need to pass this Clean Air Act. We need to pass this law that prevents children from working in factories. We need to pass this law outlining minimum workplace safety standards. We have to pass this law preventing them from dropping sludge into the river. Then you get into the next movement over, where the government is not only passing regulations, but they might actually own some of the economy. The best example in the U.S. is Amtrak. It is a government-owned national railway system. That's not capitalistic, not by any stretch. And suffice to say, what improvements has Amtrak made in the last 40 years? Not much. Government entities don't improve as quickly as private entities. Why? If you want to travel by train and you don't want to travel Amtrak, you can hop a freight, I guess. That's about the best you're going to be able to do. It's a monopoly. It's a government monopoly. And because they have no competition, there is no incentive for them to offer a superior product at the most affordable price possible. But government owns it. That's the way it is. Tennessee Valley Authority, which provides power for a good chunk of the Southeast, another government intervention into the economy. And you can point out the obvious good that the TVA has done. For large parts of the South, it provided its first ever electrification. If not for the TVA, who knows that some parts of the very rural parts of the South would still not be struggling to find something as basic as electricity. But you're giving up, again, for everything like that, you're going to give up a little something too. Our emphasis, as you will quickly determine, is going to be on the United States economy. And we're going to be looking at a couple of really simple idealized models here. And just for an example, for purposes of an example, imagine a society in which each person works to support himself. Each person sees his well-being as completely a matter of personal responsibility. They grow their own food. They make their own clothes. They build their own house. If they want a horse, they capture it and tame it out in the wild. If they want meat, go out, hunt, kill the meat, skin it, bring it back, and cook it on a fire that you built. You can claim a property as your own, and you can challenge the claim of anyone who would say otherwise, and you would settle it with fisticuffs or some type of violence. That's economic independence, and that simply does not exist anymore. That's caveman. We practice economic interdependence. People realized quickly that it was better, if you were a hunter, to have you in charge of the hunt. If you were better at growing crops, you do that. If you were better at sewing clothes, you do that. The specialization of labor, when people began concentrating on their specialized skills, they became interdependent upon each other. And in a complex society, we have to agree that is certainly the best way to do it. No one person can do it all, obviously. Not well, anyway. So as society grew, we began to form these interconnectivity, these bonds between others. We live in a society where you don't have to hunt your food. You can go to Johnny the Hunter and buy the buck that he just dropped yesterday. So you can concentrate your energy on what you do well. Now, in order to concentrate that energy, you have to sacrifice time that would have been spent in other cases. That's called opportunity cost. The real cost of doing something includes not just the cost of doing it, but also the cost of not doing something else. Economics always involves these choices. These examples demonstrate the role that innovation and productivity play. At some point, a society is going to realize that the resources it wants and needs are not limitless. We are dealing with finite resources. Couple of diagrams here for you. The first is called the circular flow diagram, and it's really the simplest entity. It takes only two entities, your household on your right and individuals, or businesses rather, on your left. The arrows indicate the direction in which these elements flow. If People provide the land, labor, and capital that create businesses. Businesses provide goods and services that they offer to the people. People spend their resources to consume the goods and services that the businesses provide. Businesses use the income they get from these sales to pay for the land and the facilities and to pay the workers with salaries or wages. It seems very simple enough. This is the most simplistic way we can demonstrate just that one interdependent relationship between the household, the individual, the business, a collective. Now, this next chart here that we're looking at now, this is a little bit more complicated in that it includes, and of course because it's more complicated, it's more accurate because economics is a complicated thing. This includes the specter of markets and international trade and how they impact everything, and of course where the government comes into all this. Some of these activities, if you buy something today, it is very, very rare that at some point in the production there was not international involvement of some sort. If you buy a can of Coke, you may think that was everything having to do with that has to do with the USA. Well, no, Coca-Cola is a multinational corporation. So even in something as innocuous as that, there are international concerns. As a general rule, as we mentioned in a government class, government itself does not create wealth. It redistributes wealth. It is the arbiter of wealth in many cases. People who specialize efforts in certain areas, who offer their goods and prices to others, create what's called a market. Market is very simply a system by which goods and services are available. Markets are ruled by this little bad boy right here. It is the law of supply and demand. It is simple, it is elegant, it is perfect. This simple-looking graph has more truth in it than many textbooks you will read. Prices in the marketplace determine whether an individual or a company can survive by supplying goods or services at a certain price and then obtaining other goods and services from others at certain prices. Prices will determine whether customers will be able to afford those goods and services. A supplier, when he receives payment, it makes it worth his effort. Again, up to a certain amount. This simplistic little graph is as close to perfection as we will get when studying economics. It is almost always true. Barter is the idea of trading. Money is the end of bartership in terms of things. Back in the day, you had a horse, your neighbor had a cow. You wanted a cow, your neighbor wanted a horse. What do? You make a deal. Let's say you have a horse and wanted a cow, but your neighbor didn't want a horse. What do you give him? Well, in our economy, we give them banknotes. These little things right here. As odd as it sounds, this is nothing more than a banknote, a promissory note. This dollar bill is nothing more than a note that says the federal government, that is, the Federal Reserve, will back this up as currency. This can be used as barter, and this is the value that we assign to this note. That's all it is. Nothing but a piece of paper. If I had this, let's say I had 1 million of these, that'd be pretty cool. What if I had 1 million of them and I'm on a deserted atoll in the South Pacific? It's worthless. But if I had 1 million of these and I was in a nation that did not accept U.S. currency or did not offer exchange for U.S. currency, it's useless. The money, the value that we put on money is determined by the value we assign it as a society. This purchasing power also is determined by our value too. That's a complicated formula. We'll get to that later, but suffice to say that dollar bill that we all love to grab and hold is nothing more than a banknote. Money has no value in and of itself. It only has value in terms of what it enables you to obtain. Money makes economic activity easier. Like we said, if you have the horse and the cow, and the guy with the cow doesn't want a horse, you can always use these banknotes enough of them at least, to get them to provide you with this thing that you want. We've already mentioned that economic trade, the international trade, seeps into just about every part of our economy. There's very, very little that you can purchase in terms of goods, services maybe, but in terms of goods that does not have some type of international aspect to it. There's, again, our society is so complex. And again, of course, we know that some American companies have found it's much more profitable to do business overseas. Thousands of companies have built factories overseas while still being American companies. They have to compete with other companies, and quite frankly, U.S. trade policy, and here again, we're getting into government involvement. Remember the continuum? When U.S. policy steps in and makes it profitable for a company to take their production and move it to Shanghai, China, and even with the added cost of building that factory and bringing the goods overseas, if it is still cheaper per unit to produce in the U.S. than it would be in the U.S., then they would be a fool not to take advantage of that opportunity. We've seen that in Southside Virginia to the nth degree. Dan River and Burlington and many other companies used federal trade policy, U.S. trade policy, to build factories in Mexico primarily, but also in Singapore and Taiwan, because even with the additional cost of shipping, they could produce their items for much, much less. Now, not fair to the American worker at all, because we have a certain standard here in America. We have laws. You have to pay workers at least this much. You have to spend money on that American factory for safety and compliance that you would not have to spend on that factory in Monterrey, Mexico. Then you get to the issue of fairness. Is that fair for the American worker who has come to rely on that company for a job? That's a whole other benefit, a whole other question. But when we get into questions of international aspects on the economy, it can get quickly complicated. Government involvement is more than just the policies. It's more than just the regulations that it places on business. Again, we have agreed that some regulations are worthwhile. As we talk about international trade, government, the taxes on imported products are called tariffs, and that is a big source of government revenue. We have, again, collectively decided that there is a purpose for government to step in at some point and to prevent capitalists from behaving like humans sometimes do. Economic institutions also are part of our economy. More than just the government. We're talking about banks, corporations, lenders, labor unions. People develop rules for the just and orderly operation of the market. We have decided collectively, even in our super capitalistic society, that there is a role for government to punish false advertising, to forbid other actions that would hinder trade, free trade, the sanctity of contracts, the safety of goods that are produced. What did we say in week 1 of government? The number one job of government is to recognize and protect personal property. We have decided that some of these government regulations on businesses and the economy are ultimately in the interest of protecting our property, individual property also. And we have ceded the fact that there are some parts of the economy, just because of their unique nature, that government is best involved in distributing. I'm talking about roads. I'm talking about water and sewer infrastructure. I'm talking about electricity, even though electricity is largely provided by private companies. We have underwritten scales whereby we incentivize a company, an electric company, to build lines to offer the infrastructure to rural Montana, even though they're not going to make as much money as they would building the same infrastructure in a densely populated area. Because if left entirely to the free economy, it is not advantageous to them to build that infrastructure to Two Dot Montana. Again, you have to spend just as much on the raw materials to build that infrastructure in Two Dot Montana as opposed to Manhattan, New York. But you're going to get a lot more subscribers and a lot more income from building that infrastructure in Manhattan. So we've decided collectively as a government, it's okay to incentivize a company so that they will provide that, what we've decided, essential service to the middle of Montana. Couple of terms here. Again, I'm not going to bore you with terms, but we do have to get this out of the way to have some language, some common language where we can discuss some deeper issues. Gross national product is basically the total output of products, stuff, basically. It is the amount of stuff we produce. GDP, gross domestic product, is the total amount of stuff that's produced within the borders of the United States, even if it's a foreign corporation. Economists have devised all other kinds of means of trying to evaluate this really, really weird thing we call an economy. Unemployment rates, rate of inflation, household income, poverty rates. Many terms that keep people gainfully employed by trying to master them apply to economics. One of the goals is to try to come up with, again, just a working knowledge of what an economy is and how it affects you. You will live a happier life if you have a better grasp of economics. Don't have to become an economist, but to know how these large, weird, wonderful things work. You will be, again, what was my goal in government, to make you a much wiser consumer of information, to make you sharp. To make sure that when people are throwing a lot of bull your way, that you can spot it and dismiss it very quickly, because they will be doing that. With a better grasp of economics, you won't be in the dark, just working for a living, watching your money go in and out, voting for whoever makes the promises you want to hear. You will be a sharp consumer. You will be harder to control. You become a citizen then, rather than a subject. We're going to bring up a few economic theorists here before we call it a day here in our first week of Econ. It will be obvious which ones I like and which ones I don't. That's not going to be, but I will, again, try to present this in an even-handed way. We're all, economically anyway, pretty much right of center here. First notable modern economist is Adam Smith, often called the father of modern economics. In 1776, the same year the U.S. declared their independence, he wrote something called The Wealth of Nations. He claimed that the human ability to develop moral thinking and to demonstrate concern for others came from a person's interaction with other people. That is to say, he was one of the first economists to go beyond numbers. He realized that an important part of economic production was human relationships. And again, just as capitalism recognizes and harnesses and rewards human nature, Adam Smith determined early on that it was absolutely essential to recognize this human nature and to operate with it. The prevailing economic philosophy before Adam Smith was called mercantilism. It was a command economy where the king and his advisors were the main proponents of power. It would be much closer to the command economy over here of today, where government bureaucrats set economic policy and everything else. Mercantilism had its start with the castle, and where the king would grant certain favors to individuals and groups and whatnot. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith told us that the wealth of nations lay in the labor that citizens supplied in producing all of the what's called necessities and conveniences that the nation either consumed or traded with other nations. That the economy actually, in this case, develops from the bottom up. The real value is us, the workers, that produce stuff, be it services or goods. The most significant economic growth, Smith said, occurs when government stays out of the way and lets the operations of an unhampered market produce profits for its participants, and profits for the king, too. In this case, it's the classic case of a rising tide lifting all ships. The king's happy. The workers are happy. Everyone's happy when this is working right. In Smith's view, is a natural order that existed in the world, and when people respect it and allow it to function, it produces good. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like John Locke, what we were talking about back in week 2 of Unit 2 of Government? The philosophical foundation for our own nation, our own constitution, that idea that man, when left to his own devices without interference, is mostly a force of good. That we in our natural state default to good. Smith's ideas on an economy was when the economy is allowed to function free of interference, it will produce mostly good. Last week, I believe it was, in government class, I put this slide up. This is probably Smith's most famous quote. I'll let you look over it again here. This is called the theory of mutual self-interest. The availability of goods and services that all people can purchase with the profits of their own labor. The goods and services, the amount they produce, the prices they charge, are best established not by government decree, but by what Smith calls the invisible hand of the market. Just as the principles apply to economic activities with a nation, they also apply to trade among nations. Basically, because the baker is looking out for his own self-interest, you have bread to buy. Because the brewer is looking out for his own self-interests, you have bread to purchase, or beer to buy, whatever. The butcher, whatever. Remember that stratification of a division, that division of labor we talked about earlier? Because these people are looking out for their self-interest, everyone else has an opportunity to purchase what Smith called the necessities and conveniences of life. The invisible hand theory has been mocked by anti-capitalists over the years, being somewhat of a fantasy. And if you think about it, yeah, it's kind of a silly little analogy, this invisible hand guiding everything. It's nothing more than human nature. It's nothing more than recognizing that people are going to go for the lower price. Sometimes they'll sacrifice price for superior quality. But they always will react positively to choice. Capitalism recognizes this. What does capitalism do? It harnesses human nature. It rewards human nature. Throughout his book, Smith showed respect beyond the economy, but for the broader philosophies of John Locke, man's personal freedom. He warned against government action that hindered national well-being because it hinders the well-being of the individual. You can see how his economic policies were extrapolated to overall human rights policies. He warned that the self-interest of businessmen could hurt people when the self-interest that we talked about, that enlightened self-interest, that mutual self-interest, hindered competition and access to goods and services. That's why one of the things that we have generally agreed on as a society is that monopolies are bad. Monopolies can form even in the best capitalistic economies. But monopolies are anti-free market. Why? When monopolies form, you don't have choice. Choice is the fuel for the free market. And we have ceded, I would say cheerfully ceded, the fact that there is a role for government in busting up monopolies. It happened, the most recent one was Ma Bell, AT&T, being broken up in the mid-late 1980s. You weren't around then, but in the early to mid-80s, a long-distance phone call cost an arm and a leg, particularly by modern dollars. After the formation of the Baby Bells, there was a competition underway in the early 1990s whereby within a year the cost of a long-distance phone call was 90% less than it was just a decade before. Why? Competition. All of a sudden, you're not paying AT&T whatever AT&T deems is right. You're paying whatever the market, the competition, says is right. And because there are 8 or 9 different companies competing for your dollar, they're going to bring the price down to make their product more palatable, more enticing. That is competition. That, another slide, laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire is French for allowed to do. Those who advocate this policy want government to refrain from any regulation of economic activity. As Smith's policies began to be adopted, it paved the way for what we call modern-day capitalism. Certainly you can see the foundation for it there. Again, the critics scoff at the idea of the notion of the invisible hand. They point to the many times that companies have exploited workers, and yes, it has happened. Hopefully what we are gaining as we move along as a society and gain wisdom is the knowledge that, generally speaking, it is best policy for government to stay out of the deadgum way in the economy. But on occasion, it is also better for them to step in and play referee and say, no, you're not playing fair. And if you don't start to play fair, we're going to punish you. On the diametric opposite side of Adam Smith in terms of philosophy, we come to Karl Marx, 19th century Prussian economist who was very much a revolutionary thinker. You know his works, The Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. Marx's theories are remarkable for many reasons. First off, though, he denies the role that the spiritual realm plays in human behavior, which is a curious thing to do. You can reject spirituality, religion, you can even reject God, but when you ignore the impact that it has on human behavior, you're probably going to fail. Because whether you agree with it or not, spiritualism in general, religiosity in specific instances, has a major, major impact on human behavior. He called religion infamously the opiate of the masses. He basically said religion was a tool to keep people quiet and compliant. In Marx's view, the history of all society was the history of class struggles. That is to say, the working class, the proletariat, and the ownership class, the bourgeoisie. In his day, as Marx saw it, the owners controlled all the means of production, the machinery, the raw materials, and they required the labor of the workers in order to produce anything of value. Marx spoke about, and I'll show you a slide here, something called the labor theory of value. The value of a product, what society says that product is worth, is derived directly, in Marx's view, from the labor needed to produce it. It's a little bit similar to Adam Smith's idea about the wealth of nations coming from the labor of the people. In that respect, they're very much on the same page. Marx called profit the surplus value charged by capitalist owners, and that the workers do not receive any of it, and this arrangement would forever handicap the working class. According to Marx, the conflict between the laborers who did not share in the profits and the capitalists who exploited the workers created the conditions of the class struggle. Marx wanted the workers to, number one, develop a class consciousness, that is to say, we are this, and he also pushed for the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie, the economy, and the governments. In his theory, the working class then would establish something that he called communism, and you can see the root part of the word, commune. When we think of communes, we might think of a bunch of hippies living out in the country who live for mutual, communal good. They each contribute to the collective, and everything is owned by everybody. There's no private ownership. That is communism. Difference there is they had a choice to enter it. If you're in a communist nation, you don't really have a choice. Anyway, we'll get to that in a second. Again, the idea, remember our continuum over here, central command economy. Economic decisions are made entirely by government bureaucrats. Marx called them the intellectual elite. And of course, he considered himself an intellectual elite. So when this utopia was going to form, people like him were going to be calling the shots. Yeah, I'd support that theory too if I were him. As workers shared in the profits of the economy, Marx said, states and governments around the world would wither away, and society would be transformed into a utopian commune in which the workers would no longer be alienated from their labor or from other people. Well, there's a whole lot wrong with that. First off, we mentioned earlier to ignore the role that spirituality plays in the human experience is absolutely foolish. It has a profound effect on what we do. The idea of a class struggle, that all society can be defined by a class struggle between basically the haves and the have-nots, is way too simplistic and ignored really what was happening during Marx's time. And what was happening then was the burgeoning, very quickly growing middle class. Not nobility, but not paupers either. Middle class, the skilled laborers, the merchants, the people who had a trade, blacksmiths, construction specialists, a burgeoning middle class that had generally enough money to live in a fairly comfortable lifestyle and not wonder where their next meal was coming from, but not opulent either. The middle class was very much emerging, while Marx was asserting that all of society was simply the haves and the have-nots. Marx was right insofar as owners have exploited workers in the past. The reality of it is not as grim as what Marx said. Marx basically implied that owners keep profits to themselves and keep them from workers. Well, that's not true. We know that owners often reinvest money into other activities, which, if it all goes well, it creates new jobs, it creates new wealth. That is one of the things about economics that is hindering our debate even today. There are some people who see wealth, the concept of wealth, as a pie, that it's finite, that if I have a slice this big and then I move it over here, it's coming at the expense of somebody else. They have no concept of the fact that wealth can be created. Wealth is not a finite thing. Wealth is created every day. Value is created every single day. If you operate from the assumption that all wealth is finite and that we are all pushing together for this limited piece of pie, yeah, I could see where you would be a supporter of Marxism-type philosophies. But that's not the case, though. Reality tells us that is simply not true. Workers now, even under our capitalistic economy, have much more benefits than they would under any other system. We know that because, again, we have allowed, I don't want to say adopting Marxist theories, but we have recognized, we have agreed with Marx that there is the potential for abuse in a capitalistic economic system. Therefore, we have allowed government to step in, do some things, to make things that level the playing field just a little bit more. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was spurred by Marxist theory. It also has been the most conspicuous example of why these policies simply do not work. They cannot work. Central planners sitting behind walls cannot efficiently or effectively dictate something as complicated as an economy. It cannot happen. You cannot have a group of intellectual elite, no matter how smart they are, to be able to determine the best way to run an economy. It is vast, it is constantly changing, and people react. People react to the stimuluses or stimuli that they see. People do not risk their lives to get into socialist nations. They risk their lives to leave socialist nations. They don't scale mighty walls to flee capitalism. They scale mighty walls to access capitalism. Watch where the people are going. They'll tell you. No communist country has ever developed into a worker's paradise. It has been the exact opposite. I have been fortunate enough to know some people who actually grew up in Soviet bloc countries and have had conversations with them. The way they talk about the societal structure makes my skin crawl. Mostly because there were a lot of people that certainly just simply accepted that was the way life was. That you existed, you drew a check every so often for doing this little thing you were told to do by the local political party. You went back to your government-provided apartment, did whatever. That's not living, that's existing. I choose to live, and always will. Economic policies in the United States have generally been much closer, thank God, to Adam Smith than to Karl Marx. Unfortunately, if you look at surveys today, younger people are developing a more positive view of socialism. Now, they see socialism. Let's bring up our little continuum here. We talked about how some over here is complete free market, over here is complete command. When you move over here, you're kind of in the U.S. territory where there's some strict government regulations on some sectors of the economy. There's even government ownership of Amtrak and USPS, whatever. They're looking at socialism as being more over here, where the government has these regulations and owns a lot of the economy. In the United Kingdom, government owns all mining operations. In Scandinavia, the government owns all education. Government owns all religion in Scandinavia. That's what they're associating with socialism. That's their view of socialism. That's not socialism. Over here is socialism. Over here is when your future is determined by government planners. Over here is where you are told whether or not you can purchase a product. And again, over here is existing, not living. A lot of people are being taught that this over here is the socialism we should gun for. Not the case. That's sort of a semantics issue. Adam Smith believed that decisions on the economy should be spread out as widely as possible. The invisible hand touches everybody. That way there is no one person or one group of people who is responsible for basic economic decisions. It is all of us and our behavior. The way we behave, the way we value certain things over others. The basis of socialism is the belief that people need to be managed and regulated because they cannot be trusted to make the right decisions on their own. Number one, that is incorrect. Number two, that is repugnant. That is a rejection of the inherent goodness that we all have in the image of our God. And I hope we always see it that way. We will talk about a couple of other economists just very, very briefly here. I'm about to hit a dead-gum hour. Ludwig von Mises, part of the Austrian School of Economics, his belief was that command economies would eventually fail, over here, the Russian whatever, because government planners could not organize a strong, complex economy. And certainly the fall of communism in Europe validated his belief. Another one of my favorites, Friedrich Hayek, wrote The Road to Serfdom. Government-planned and government-controlled economies led to tyranny because of the increasing amount of power that it demands. If you're going to be over here controlling everyone's economic decisions, that's going to require a level of authority that eventually is going to have to be enforced at the point of a gun. Russia validated everything Hayek said. For many people, the debate has become not whether government should be involved in an economy, but to what extent it should be. The pratfalls, of course, of the increased government involvement in an economy is the possibility that people can become dependent on the government in that respect. That is something we have to keep an eye out on. This debate will always continue. Boy, I have talked an awful lot. Economics is a very complicated thing. And even though this continuum I keep going back to, free market, command economy, it's simplistic, but it is the best representation of the schools of thought that we're dealing with when it comes to the economy. Next week, we're going to look a little bit more at biblical principles and how they are enmeshed into economic theory. Until then, we'll see you Monday. Have a great weekend.